My brother fraudulently stole my father's inheritance and called me a loser. You should have seen his face when the police arrested him. I pulled into my mother's driveway at exactly 10 a.m., as she had asked. The snow crunched under my boots as I stepped out, hands shoved into my coat pockets against the biting cold. I wasn't late. If anything, I was right on time, even though a part of me already suspected something was off. The front door was unlocked, as usual. I stepped inside and was immediately greeted by the warm scent of cinnamon, pine, and something freshly baked. But what struck me first wasn't the smell of Christmas, it was the quiet. Too quiet. As I walked into the living room, I realized why. Everyone was already here. Not just here, but settled. Comfortable. The wrapping paper from the gifts had been tossed into a plastic bag in the corner. The dining table was mostly cleared, save for a few stray crumbs and a nearly empty platter of cookies. My sister, Alina, was leaning back on the couch, scrolling through her phone while her husband, Andre, laughed at something my uncle had just said. No one looked up. No one even reacted to me walking in. Except Timur. My 12-year-old nephew, the only one who actually seemed happy to see me, jumped up from his seat and ran over. Dima, look what I got. He shoved a Nintendo Switch into my hands, eyes shining with excitement. I got 3 new games. Wanna see? I forced a smile, trying to push down the irritation bubbling in my chest. Of course, buddy, I said, ruffling his hair. But inside, I was fuming. I turned to my mother, who was coming in from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. I thought you said to be here at 10? I asked, keeping my voice neutral. She didn't even look guilty. She just sighed like I was making a big deal out of nothing. Oh, Dima, we started a little earlier. You know how the kids are. They wake up early, and we didn't want to wait forever. A little earlier? From the looks of it, they had started hours ago. The thought stung more than I wanted to admit. I took a slow breath. So, you all just went ahead without me? My sister finally glanced up from her phone, raising an eyebrow. Don't be dramatic, she muttered. You're here now. I clenched my jaw but said nothing. What was the point? It was clear I had been an afterthought. Again, Timur tugged my sleeve. Come on, Dima. I'll show you my favorite one. His enthusiasm was the only thing keeping me from turning around and walking right back out the door. Yeah, let's see, I said, forcing a smile again. At least someone was happy I was here. I barely had a chance to sit down before I heard my brother's voice cutting through the room. Don't distract your uncle, Timur, Ola said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. He doesn't know anything about those things anyway. Too busy with his successful life. The way he said it, successful, like it was some kind of joke, made my stomach tighten. I glanced up from Timur's game, meeting Ola's smirk across the room. He was lounging in one of the armchairs, swirling a glass of something dark, probably whiskey, his holiday drink of choice. I felt Timur hesitate beside me, his small hands still gripping the console. Even he could sense the tension. I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to stay calm. Yeah, you're right, Ola. I probably don't know as much as you do about gaming, I said, keeping my voice light. I mean, I just work in tech. What would I know? That should have been the end of it. But of course it wasn't. Oh sure, Ola scoffed. That's exactly what I meant. Our golden boy, the big-shot IT guy, jet-setting around the world while the rest of us are stuck in reality. I clenched my jaw. Here we go again. It wasn't the first time I'd heard this. Every family gathering, it was the same passive-aggressive jabs. They never said it outright, but I knew what they thought. That I was selfish. That I had abandoned them for some cushy, carefree life. That I had it too easy while they were stuck with mortgages, kids, and responsibilities. Never mind the fact that I had worked my ass off for everything I had. That I had sacrificed sleep, stability, relationships. To them, I was just the guy who got lucky. Right? I muttered, focusing back on Timur's screen. Well, I guess I'll have to rely on you to teach me, kid. Timur nodded eagerly, clearly wanting to steer the conversation back to his game. But I could still feel Ola watching me, waiting for me to snap, to give him something to argue about. I refused to give him the satisfaction. Instead, I just kept playing. Lunch was supposed to be the one part of the day where I could at least eat in peace. I had already swallowed my irritation from the morning, ignored Ola's usual passive-aggressive jabs, and focused on Timur's excitement instead. But of course, my family couldn't let me get through one meal without turning it into some kind of intervention. I had barely taken my second bite when Alina, my brother's mother-in-law, turned to me with that overly sweet, probing tone that always meant trouble. So, Dimitro, she said, setting down her fork, Do you have anyone special in your life? I already knew where this was going. Before I could even respond, she went on, smiling like she was doing me a favor. You know, it's time to start a family. Timur needs cousins. I swallowed my food slowly, considering my options. I could deflect, change the subject, make a joke, but it wouldn't matter. The second someone in this family set their sights on a topic, they latched on like a dog with a bone. I barely had time to open my mouth before Ola jumped in, his voice thick with mock concern. "Oh, come on, Alina," he said, grinning. "Dima doesn't have a wife. No kids, no life." A few chuckles rippled across the table. I felt my grip tighten around my fork. And then, the worst part, the nodding. One by one, heads bobbed in agreement. Even my mother, who didn't look at me but still gave a little nod as if she found no flaw in what had just been said. "It's true," someone muttered. "Well, he's not getting any younger," another added. "Exactly. It's different for women, but for men, why wait?" The conversation had moved beyond me. I wasn't even required for it anymore. They were talking about my life like I wasn't sitting right there, like I was some kind of project they needed to fix. I let out a slow breath, setting my fork down carefully. "Wow," I said, forcing a laugh. "Didn't realize we were doing life evaluations over lunch. Should I pass out scorecards, or?" No one laughed. Ola smirked, leaning back. "We're just saying, man. You think you're so different, living that bachelor life, but at the end of the day, you're the one sitting at this table alone." I felt the heat rising in my chest, that familiar frustration bubbling up. But what could I even say? That I was happy? That I liked my life? That I didn't need their approval? It wouldn't matter. They had already decided that I was missing something, that I was incomplete. So I did the only thing I could. I picked up my fork and kept eating. Let them talk. I sat there, staring at them, my appetite gone, my hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly that my knuckles turned white. My brother, leaning back in his chair, looked as if he had just handled some routine business transaction, while my mother, sitting across from me, had the nerve to appear tired of this conversation, as if I was the one being unreasonable. The words echoed in my head, almost all of it. They hadn't just taken a small portion. They had taken nearly everything that was meant to be mine. They had stolen from me, and they hadn't even hesitated. Worse, they genuinely believed they were in the right, that I should be grateful, that I should just accept it and move on because it had been done in the so-called best interest of the family. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to keep my voice steady, even as rage churned in my chest. "So let me get this straight. You took my inheritance, the money that was left to me, and decided to use it for your own debts, house repairs, and whatever else you deemed necessary, and you didn't even ask me?" My voice was calm, but there was a dangerous edge to it, one that even Timur, sitting beside me, seemed to pick up on as he shifted uncomfortably. Ola rolled his eyes, as if my anger was an overreaction, as if he was the one being inconvenienced by this conversation. "Jesus, Dima, it's not like you needed it. What were you even going to do with it? Buy another plane ticket? Upgrade your laptop? Come on, man, you don't have a mortgage, you don't have kids, you don't have responsibilities. We needed that money, and you have your whole life set already." I let out a hollow laugh, shaking my head in disbelief. "You needed it? So that just makes it okay? You think because I don't have a wife and kids that my money is just free for the taking? That my own family can decide for me what I do with what's mine?" I turned to my mother, whose lips were pressed into a thin line, her hands still neatly folded as if she were waiting for this whole thing to be over. "And you went along with this?" She sighed, her expression unreadable, but there was no remorse, no shame, only the same tired patience she had always shown when she thought I was being difficult. "Dimitro, it's not about taking from you. It's about helping the family. Timur's education is important. The house needed work. Ola and Alina," she hesitated just for a second, then continued as if it didn't even matter. "They were struggling." I let out a sharp breath, my head spinning. So I was just supposed to accept this? Without even knowing? Without even having a choice? My voice rose slightly despite my best efforts to stay calm, but I didn't care anymore. They had crossed a line that couldn't be undone, and the worst part was that none of them saw the problem. Ola scoffed again, shaking his head. "You're acting like we stole from you. It's family money, Dima. You always talk about how well you're doing, how much you're traveling, how free you are. You don't need it, but we do. What would you rather have? Your nephew struggling with his future? Mom's house falling apart? Us drowning in debt while you sit there in some fancy apartment booking your next flight to God knows where?" I exhaled sharply, my jaw tightening as I tried to keep myself from losing control. You're damn right I'm acting like you stole from me, because that's exactly what you did. I pushed my chair back, standing so abruptly that Timur flinched beside me. I hated that he was here for this, that he was hearing all of it, that he was going to think this was normal, that this was just what family did. I had spent years convincing myself that, despite everything, my family was still family, that even if we didn't see eye to eye, there was some kind of line they wouldn't cross. But that was a lie. The truth was that they had never seen me as an equal. To them, I was just a resource, something to be taken from when it was convenient, something to be dismissed when I wasn't needed. I could feel every pair of eyes on me as I grabbed my coat, but I didn't care. I didn't care what excuses they made, what justifications they tried to throw my way. I was done pretending that this was normal, that I had to accept this just because we shared blood. Ola let out a low chuckle, shaking his head as he took another sip of his drink. Jesus, man. Stop being so dramatic. I turned to him, my voice steady but cold. You're dead to me. A few gasps came from around the table, but I didn't wait for their reactions. I pulled on my coat, ignoring my mother's voice calling my name, ignoring whatever pathetic justification she was about to throw at me next. I had nothing left to say to them. As I stepped toward the door, I felt a small tug at my sleeve. I looked down and saw Timur staring up at me, his face uncertain, his fingers still clutching his gaming console. You're leaving? His voice was quiet, hesitant, like he already knew the answer. I felt something in my chest tighten, but I forced a small smile for his sake. Yeah, kid. I am. He hesitated, then nodded slowly. Can I still call you? I crouched down so we were eye level, ignoring the way the room had gone completely silent around us. Of course, buddy. You can always call me. He nodded again, gripping his console a little tighter, and I ruffled his hair one last time before standing up and walking to the door. I didn't look back as I stepped outside into the cold, the sharp winter air burning against my skin as I took my first breath of freedom. I was done. I stood there for a moment, letting the silence stretch between us, letting them all sit with what they had done, with the weight of their betrayal pressing down on the room. I could feel my mother watching me, waiting for me to calm down, to let it go, to do what I had always done. Swallow the anger, force a smile, and pretend none of this mattered. But this time was different. This time, I wasn't going to let them brush it aside. Wasn't going to let them reduce my worth to some bottomless well they could pull from whenever they pleased. I exhaled slowly, smoothing my coat as I pushed my chair back. The legs scraped against the floor, the sound cutting through the tense silence. I met my mother's gaze, then Ola's, and finally let my eyes drift across the table, taking in the faces of people who had just unanimously decided I was nothing more than a walking bank account. My voice was calm, eerily so, devoid of the emotion that threatened to crack through the surface. Thank you for lunch. That was all I said. I turned, walking toward the door, feeling the weight of their stunned silence behind me. I knew they expected a fight. They expected me to explode, to lash out, to argue so they could turn it around on me. So they could say, *C, this is why we didn't tell him. He always overreacts, *, but I wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. I wasn't going to give them anything. My mother was the first to react. Dima. I didn't stop. I didn't turn around. I stepped out into the cold without another word, pulling the door shut behind me. The icy wind hit my face as I took a deep breath, letting it fill my lungs, letting it ground me. My hands were shaking, but not from the cold. I pulled my phone from my pocket, ignoring the first call from my mother, then the second. The vibrations rattled in my hand, but I swiped to silence them, walking down the driveway with steady steps. The snow crunched beneath my boots as I reached my car, gripping the handle for a moment before forcing myself to let go, before forcing myself to breathe. Then, without hesitation, I scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I hadn't dialed in years. My father's lawyer. I pressed the call button and lifted the phone to my ear. He picked up after 2 rings. Dimitro? His voice was calm, professional, but I could hear the hint of surprise. Maybe even curiosity, lurking underneath. Yes, I said, my voice steady now. I need to meet with you as soon as possible. There was a slight pause on the other end. Then, a quiet inhale. I see, he said. Regarding your father's estate? I glanced back at the house one last time, watching as the curtains shifted slightly. Someone was peeking out, probably my mother, probably watching to see if I would cool off and come back inside like I always had before. Not this time. Yes, I said, turning away, opening my car door, and sliding inside. Regarding what's left of it, the next morning, I arrived at the lawyer's office still running on the raw adrenaline from the day before. I hadn't slept much. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, my mind replayed the conversation. My mother's blank expression, Ola's smug smirk, the way the entire family had nodded along as if robbing me was just a reasonable business decision. But I knew one thing. I wasn't going to let this go. The office smelled of old leather and paper, the kind of place where deals were made and lives were changed with a few signatures. The lawyer, an older man named Vadim Kovalenko, greeted me with a firm handshake and led me into his office, motioning for me to sit. I barely had time to get comfortable before he placed a thick folder in front of me. I took the liberty of pulling up some documents last night after your call, he said, adjusting his glasses. You were right to contact me, Dimitro. There are significant concerns regarding your inheritance. I exhaled slowly, preparing myself for whatever version of theft I was about to hear. But nothing could have prepared me for what came next. Vadim flipped open the folder and slid a stack of papers toward me. Ola forged your signature, he said, his voice sharp and professional. Repeatedly. He took out multiple loans in your name. Over $300,000, to be exact. For a moment, I just stared at the papers, the numbers blurring together as my brain struggled to catch up. $300,000. I could barely hear over the rush of blood in my ears. My fingers trembled as I flipped through the documents. Sure enough, there it was. My name, written in a signature that looked just close enough to mine to pass a casual glance, but I knew instantly that it wasn't mine. That's not my signature, I said, my voice cold, controlled. Vadim nodded. I assumed as much. He tapped the document. These loans were taken out over the past few years. Quietly, carefully. Most of them have high interest rates, and they're all linked directly to your credit. I clenched my jaw. How the hell did he pull this off? He had access to enough of your personal information to make it work. I'd guess tax documents, old paperwork from when you still lived here. Maybe even something he got through your mother. I let out a slow breath, forcing myself to stay calm. This wasn't just petty theft. This wasn't just a greedy sibling dipping into the family pot. This was fraud. This was criminal. And then Vadim flipped to the next page, and whatever breath I had left was stolen from my lungs. There's more, he said grimly. Ola also made an attempt to have you declared financially incapacitated. My eyes snapped up to his. Asterisk what? Asterisk. Vadim exhaled. He filed a petition. Claimed you were reckless with money, that you were incapable of managing your own assets. His argument was that since you travel so often, live abroad, don't have a family to ground you, you were unstable and needed someone responsible to oversee your finances. Naturally, he nominated himself. I gripped the armrests of the chair, trying to keep my breathing steady. This wasn't just a scam. It wasn't just about money. Ola had been planning this for years, setting the foundation, quietly building a case so that when the time came, he could take everything. If I hadn't come home, if I hadn't gotten suspicious, if I had waited just a little longer to get involved, he might have succeeded. Vadim leaned forward. The petition didn't go through. It was dismissed before it reached court, likely because there wasn't enough evidence to support it. But the fact that he tried it all, he shook his head. That's serious, Dimitro. Serious was an understatement. This wasn't just about the inheritance anymore. This was about control, about power. Ola had looked at my life, at everything I had worked for, and decided that he was entitled to it. And my own mother had let it happen. I closed the folder carefully, pressing my palms against the table to ground myself. What are my options? Vadim studied me for a moment before nodding, as if he had been waiting for that exact question. We have enough to file charges. Bank fraud, identity theft, possibly even attempted financial abuse. But if we pursue this, it won't just be a family matter anymore. This will be criminal. I met his gaze, my decision already made. Good, I said, my voice cold and steady. Let's bury him. I sat in Vadim's office, my mind still reeling from the weight of everything I had just learned. Ola had stolen from me, forged my signature, tried to have me declared legally incapable so he could take control of everything I had worked for. And my mother, whether she had been complicit or just willfully ignorant, had let it happen. I had come in expecting to uncover something ugly, but I hadn't been prepared for just how deep the betrayal ran. Vadim, sensing my anger, remained quiet for a moment before sliding another folder across the desk. There's one more thing, he said, his voice unreadable. Your father's will. I exhaled sharply. Let me guess. Ola and my mother already carved it up for themselves? Vadim shook his head. Not exactly. Your father. He saw this coming. I frowned. What do you mean? Vadim opened the folder and pulled out a thick, stapled document. Your father changed his will shortly before he passed. From what I can tell, he must have suspected what would happen once he was gone. He put specific clauses in place to prevent exactly this kind of situation. I leaned forward, suddenly alert. What kind of clauses? Vadim tapped the document. First, everyone who took money without permission. Your mother, Ola, Alina. They are required to pay it back before they can receive a single cent of their inheritance. He flipped the page, his expression unreadable. And second, you, Dimitro, are the only person who has the authority to oversee the repayment process. For a moment, I just stared at him, my brain scrambling to process what he had just said. Wait, what? Vadim gave a small, satisfied nod. Your father made sure that you were the only one who can sign off on their repayment. If they don't pay back every cent they took, they get nothing. I sat back in my chair, stunned. My father, a man of few words, a man I had always assumed was distant and uninvolved in family matters, had seen through all of them. He had known. Maybe he hadn't known the full extent of Oluwa's greed, but he had anticipated enough to protect me from it. I let out a short, sharp laugh, part amusement, part disbelief. So let me get this straight. Ola and Alina are drowning in debt. My mother's already spent whatever she took, and now they're completely screwed unless I decide to let them have their inheritance? Vadim smiled slightly. That's correct. For the first time since I had arrived home, the weight on my chest lightened. I could already picture the panic that would spread across Oluwa's face when he realized what this meant, that he wouldn't just be able to take, manipulate, and steal his way into security. That for once, he was powerless. I leaned forward, meeting Vadim's gaze. Let's make this official. The so-called family meeting was scheduled for Sunday afternoon, and by the time I arrived at my mother's house, it was clear that Ola had been busy rallying his troops. The living room was packed with familiar faces, relatives who had never bothered to call unless they needed something, distant aunts and uncles who always conveniently sided with whoever held the most power, and even a man I didn't recognize, dressed in a sharp suit, sitting beside Ola with a knowing smirk. I didn't need an introduction to figure out who he was. One of Ola's financial advisors, no doubt brought in to intimidate me with complicated numbers and legal jargon. I stepped inside, my expression neutral, my heart steady. I had spent the last few days preparing for this, and I wasn't walking in blind. Vadim had given me everything I needed, the proof, the leverage, the final nail in Oluwa's coffin. My mother stood near the dining table, her hands wringing together anxiously. She hadn't spoken to me since I walked out of that Christmas lunch, and judging by the redness in her eyes, she had spent most of the morning crying. Whether it was guilt, fear, or just the stress of her carefully maintained world crumbling, I didn't know. And at this moment, I didn't care. Ola was the first to speak, standing with all the arrogance of a man who still believed he was in control. Dima, he greeted smoothly, gesturing to the room as if this was some kind of casual family gathering and not a last-ditch attempt to manipulate me. Glad you could make it. I didn't respond, just took a seat on the couch across from him, my posture relaxed, my eyes sharp. Let's get this over with. Ola exchanged a quick glance with the suited man beside him, then sighed dramatically. Look, man, this has all gotten way out of hand. You're making things complicated for no reason. We're family. We shouldn't be fighting over money like this. I let out a short laugh, shaking my head. Oh, is that what we're doing? Funny, because I don't remember being part of the discussion when you stole from me. His jaw tightened, but he kept his voice smooth. It wasn't stealing. It was redistributing resources for the good of the family. You don't have kids, you don't have a house to maintain. You don't need that money the way we do. I arched an eyebrow. And yet, here you are, panicking now that I do have control over it. Interesting. The financier cleared his throat, finally speaking. Mr. Dimitro, I understand your frustration, but there are financial realities to consider. This money, if released, would benefit not just your brother but the entire family. I turned my gaze to him. Is that so? I leaned forward slightly. Tell me, did Ola mention that he forged my signature for over $300,000 in loans? There was a brief flicker of surprise on the financier's face before he schooled his expression. That? I cut him off. Or did he tell you that he attempted to have me legally declared financially incompetent so he could take control of my assets? Silence. Ola scoffed, but his confidence was fading. Oh, come on. Don't be dramatic. I ignored him and reached into my bag, pulling out a neatly stacked folder. But you know what's really interesting? The fact that he didn't just steal from me. That got my mother's attention. She looked up sharply, her red-rimmed eyes blinking in confusion. What? I slid the folder onto the table and flipped it open, revealing the bank statements and contract copies Vadim had given me the night before. You see, Mom, while Ola was so busy making financial decisions for the good of the family, he also took out a second mortgage on your house. I turned to her, my voice calm but firm. Without telling you. For a moment, there was nothing but stunned silence. Then my mother's face drained of color. No, she whispered, shaking her head. That's not possible. I pushed the documents toward her. Go ahead. See for yourself. Her hands trembled as she picked up the papers, scanning the pages with wide, disbelieving eyes. Then she gasped, a sharp, broken sound, as she came across the forged signature. Her name, written in Ola's hand. Her lip quivered as she turned to my brother. Ola. Her voice cracked. Tell me this isn't true. Ola shifted uncomfortably, but the panic was creeping into his face. Mom, listen. It's not a big deal. I had a plan to pay it back. She slammed the papers onto the table, her breath coming in short, uneven gasps. You lied to me. You took my house, my home, and you. She turned to the financier, her voice breaking. You knew about this? The man's face paled, and he quickly stood, grabbing his briefcase. I wasn't aware of the full. I should go. He made a beeline for the door, practically fleeing as the room erupted into chaos. My mother was sobbing now, her hands shaking as she buried her face in them. How could you do this, Ola? How could you lie to me like this? Ola was panicking, looking between her, me, and the relatives, but no one was coming to his defense now. His carefully built house of lies had crumbled, and there was no one left to clean up the mess but him. I leaned back, watching it all unfold. For years, I had been the outsider in my own family, the one who was expected to give but never take, the one who was dismissed until they needed something. They had underestimated me. They had assumed I would always bend, always back down. But not this time. I stood up, adjusting my coat as I looked at my mother one last time. She was still crying, still holding the papers like they were proof that her entire world had just shattered. Maybe they had, but that wasn't my problem anymore. I turned to Ola, meeting his frantic, desperate gaze with a cold, steady one. You wanted to play this game, I said quietly. You just never expected to lose. Then I walked out, leaving him to deal with the ruins of everything he had built. I stood near the doorway, watching as the weight of reality finally sank into my mother's tear-streaked face, and the panic in Ola's eyes turned into something closer to desperation. The relatives, who had come here expecting to watch me cave under pressure, now sat in stunned silence, too ashamed or too afraid to take Ola's side. But I wasn't finished yet. I cleared my throat, drawing their attention back to me. Here's how this is going to go, I said, my voice calm, controlled, but carrying enough authority that even Ola shut his mouth. First, my mother's house will be placed under independent management immediately. She is not to sign anything without legal oversight. If I have to go to court to make that happen, I will. I turned to Vadim, who had accompanied me but remained silent, taking everything in. I'll need those papers drawn up by tomorrow. Vadim nodded, already reaching into his bag to make a note. Ola let out a strangled noise of protest, but I ignored him. Second, Timur's educational savings will be frozen. Effective now. No withdrawals, no transfers, nothing. Any attempt to touch that money without my approval will be met with legal consequences. My mother flinched, her hands still gripping the documents that confirmed the betrayal she had refused to see. But it's for his future, she murmured weakly. I looked directly at her, my expression unforgiving. Exactly. Which is why I don't trust either of them with it. Ola was breathing heavily now, his face red with barely contained rage. You can't do this, Dima. You're acting like some dictator. I turned to him, tilting my head slightly. Oh, I can do this. And I am doing this. He scoffed, throwing his hands in the air. And what do you expect us to do? Just sit around while you play king of the family? I gave him a slow, cold smile. No. You and Alina will be attending financial counseling. Alina, who had been quiet through most of this, suddenly sat up straighter. What? I looked at both of them. You two clearly have no concept of how to manage money without lying, stealing, or gambling it away. So now, you'll learn. You'll be attending financial counseling sessions until a licensed professional confirms that you're fit to handle your own finances. Until then, Any inheritance you might receive stays locked. Ola's nostrils flared. You can't make us do that. Fine, I said with a shrug. Then you get nothing. Take it or leave it. My mother let out a soft whimper, rubbing her temples, as if the reality of what her son had done, and what I was now doing, was finally hitting her in full force. The room was suffocatingly silent. Then, a small voice broke through. I have proof. We all turned. Timur stood near the couch, his Nintendo Switch abandoned at his side, his face unusually serious for a 12-year-old. He had been quiet throughout all of this, but now, as he clutched his tablet in both hands, his voice was steady, determined. Ola frowned. Timur, what are you talking about? Timur swallowed hard, then squared his shoulders. I recorded the conversation, he said, gripping the device tighter. All of it. A stunned silence fell over the room. Alina shot up from her chair. Asterisk what? Asterisk. Timur flinched slightly at her tone but didn't back down. I heard everything. The way you lied. The way Dad took money from Uncle Dima. The way you both tried to make him feel bad for not giving in. I recorded it all. His voice wavered slightly, but he pushed through. And if you try to do anything, I'll show it to everyone. Ola looked like he had been slapped. Timur, give me that tablet. Now. Timur clutched it to his chest, stepping back. No. Alina's face was contorted in rage. Timur, we are your parents. You do not talk back to us like this. Timur's lips trembled slightly, but his eyes were defiant. You always tell me to be honest. But you lied. He looked at me, then at the rest of the family. Uncle Dima didn't do anything wrong. You did. For the first time, Ola looked genuinely nervous. He ran a hand through his hair, glancing around as if searching for support, but no one came to his defense. The same relatives who had nodded along with him before were now avoiding his gaze, their loyalty dissolving the moment they realized they had backed the wrong side. I turned to Vadim. Make sure we get that recording backed up. Just in case. Vadim nodded, giving Timur a small approving glance before reaching for his phone. Ola was fuming now, his hands balled into fists at his sides. You think you've won? His voice was low, bitter. You think you're better than us? I picked up my coat, sliding it on with ease. No, Ola. I don't think I've won. I looked around at the mess he had created, at the broken trust, the ruined reputation, the terrified look in his own son's eyes. Then I met his gaze one last time. I know I have. And with that, I walked out. Ola must have realized how bad things were the moment I walked out of that so-called family meeting, but knowing my brother, I was sure he wouldn't just sit back and accept defeat. He had spent his entire life manipulating situations to his advantage, bending people's emotions, and taking whatever he wanted without consequence, so there was no way he would stop now. He was desperate, and desperate people do stupid things. By the time he attempted to withdraw money from our mother's account the following morning, I had already made sure he wouldn't get a single cent. Vadim and I had worked fast, locking down every account connected to the inheritance, placing financial restrictions on my mother's assets, freezing every single fund that he had previously had access to, and ensuring that no loophole existed for him to exploit. I had expected him to try something reckless, but even I hadn't anticipated the sheer level of panic he would display when he realized his free ride was over. The bank had called me first, then Vadim, informing us that Ola had stormed in, red-faced and agitated, demanding a withdrawal. When he was told that the accounts were frozen and that he no longer had any control over the funds, he had caused such a scene that security had to escort him out of the building, shouting about how this was all some mistake, how I was trying to sabotage him, how he was the victim. But Ola's problems were only just beginning. Vadim had spent the last few days combing through the financial records, and what he uncovered made the stolen inheritance look like pocket change. Ola hadn't just taken money from me. He had built an entire network of fraudulent loans, forged documents, and shady financial dealings that spanned years. It turned out that my brother had been running his own quiet little empire of theft, taking out loans under false pretenses, forging signatures, and moving money through accounts that barely existed before wiping them clean. Some of those loans weren't just in my name. They were in the names of family members who had trusted him, people who had never even realized they were sinking into debt until Vadim presented the documents proving it. For years, Ola had hidden behind the illusion of responsibility, presenting himself as the mature, stable one while painting me as the reckless, selfish outsider who didn't understand the value of family. But as soon as the truth came out, that illusion shattered instantly. The same relatives who had nodded in agreement when he mocked me, who had backed him when he tried to guilt-trip me into handing over my inheritance, were now staring at him in open disgust, whispering among themselves about how they had been blind, how they had trusted the wrong son, how they had let themselves be deceived. The shift was immediate and brutal, and for the first time, Ola had no one left to manipulate. Even Alina, his ever-loyal wife, turned on him the moment she realized just how deep the financial ruin went. She tried to act as though she had been just as much of a victim as everyone else, bursting into tears and wailing about how she hadn't known what he was doing, how she had trusted him, how she was innocent in all of this. But nobody believed her, least of all the relatives who were now staring at loan documents with their own names on them, realizing that the debt they had been struggling with wasn't just bad luck, it was Ola. My mother, who had spent years defending him, always taking his side, always dismissing my concerns, sat in complete silence, staring at the papers with a hollow look in her eyes. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about the fact that her favorite son, the one she had believed in so blindly, had taken out a second mortgage on her house behind her back, forging her signature and putting her home at risk without even telling her. She looked up at him then, her face pale and unreadable, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the documents, and in that moment, I saw the exact second when the truth hit her, when the realization finally settled that the son she had trusted the most had lied to her in the worst possible way. "Ola," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but he wouldn't meet her eyes. He looked around instead, searching for someone, anyone, who would still take his side, but the room was against him now, and there was nowhere left to run. I let the silence drag out, watching him squirm, watching as he realized that the game was over and he had lost everything. When he finally turned to me, his face twisted with frustration and desperation. His voice was no longer mocking or arrogant. It was pleading, almost panicked. "Dima, please," he said, stepping forward as if he could somehow close the distance between us, as if we could somehow go back to how things were before. "You can't just leave me like this. You're my brother." I exhaled slowly, tilting my head as I considered his words, but I already knew there was no room left for sympathy. Maybe once, long ago, I would have hesitated. I would have felt guilty. I would have told myself that blood was thicker than water and that family was worth forgiving. But not anymore. Not after everything he had done. Not after what he had tried to take from me. "I could have forgiven the money," I said finally, my voice quiet but unwavering. "I could have forgiven the insults, the manipulation, the way you've tried to make me feel like I was never enough. But you didn't just take money, Ola. You stole people's lives. You stole from your own mother, from your own son, from the family you claimed to care so much about. You wanted to take everything from me, and now you have nothing left." Ola's mouth opened slightly, as if he wanted to argue, as if he still thought there was a way out of this, but there wasn't. I turned to Vadim, who had been standing beside me, calmly watching the entire collapse unfold. "Make sure everything is processed," I said simply, "and forward the fraud evidence to the right people. I don't care what happens after that." Vadim nodded, already gathering the necessary paperwork, and Ola's face paled when he realized what that meant, when he realized that this wasn't just about family anymore. This was legal, this was real, and there was no coming back from it. His desperation turned into full-blown panic, but nobody was listening to him anymore. Alina had already grabbed her purse and was quietly edging toward the door. The relatives were muttering among themselves, shaking their heads in disgust, and my mother, the one person who had always defended him, simply sat there, staring blankly ahead, as if she had finally accepted that she had spent her entire life believing in the wrong son. I didn't need to say anything else. There was nothing left to discuss, nothing left to salvage. Ola had played his game. He had made his moves, and he had lost, not just his money, but his family, his reputation, and whatever power he had once thought he held over me. Without another word, I turned toward the door, stepping outside into the cold winter air, feeling the weight of years of resentment finally lift off my shoulders. This time, I wasn't leaving as the outcast, the forgotten one, the one who never quite fit. This time, I was leaving on my own terms. And as I walked away, I knew one thing for certain. Ola had spent his entire life making sure I would never win. But in the end, he had destroyed himself. In the weeks that followed, Ola and Alina's lives crumbled piece by piece, and for the first time in his life, there was no one left to shield him from the consequences of his own actions. The fraud case moved swiftly once Vadim sent the evidence to the right authorities, and within days, Ola found himself drowning in legal trouble that even his most desperate attempts at damage control couldn't fix. His financial schemes had gone too far, the paper trail was too obvious, and by the time the banks and lenders realized how deep the deception ran, there was no negotiating his way out of it. Their house, already weighed down by multiple unpaid loans, was seized. Their accounts, drained of whatever stolen money they had once lived on, were frozen. The so-called friends who had once admired Ola for his confidence and status disappeared overnight, leaving him and Alina stranded with nothing. My mother, still shaken by the discovery that her golden son had stolen from her, refused to speak to him. Whether it was guilt, shame, or just exhaustion, she barely left the house, choosing to sit in the silence of her own regret rather than face what she had allowed to happen. The rest of the family, once so quick to take Ola aside, pretended they had never supported him in the first place, whispering behind closed doors about how they had been tricked, how they never really trusted him, how they always had a bad feeling. It was pathetic. They had let it happen. They had cheered him on when they thought they could benefit from it. But the moment he lost everything, they abandoned him just as quickly as he had abandoned me all those years ago. But while Ola and Alina spiraled, Timur made a decision that no one saw coming. One evening, as I was reviewing some paperwork with Vadim regarding the final legal steps to secure the inheritance and transfer properties, I heard a knock on my apartment door. When I opened it, I found Timur standing there, a duffel bag over his shoulder, looking up at me with an expression that was far too serious for a 12-year-old. "I want to live with you," he said, his voice steady but quiet. I blinked, caught off guard. "Timur, what are you talking about? Where's your mom?" He shifted the bag on his shoulder, gripping the strap tightly. "She's at my grandma's. Dad is. I don't know where he is, but I don't want to live with them. I don't trust them." His voice wavered slightly, but he took a deep breath, standing firm. "I don't want to be like them, Uncle Dima. I want to study finance, but not to steal from people. I want to help people." I stared at him, processing his words, and for the first time in weeks, something in my chest softened. Timur had seen everything. The lies, the greed, the betrayal. And instead of following in his father's footsteps, he had chosen to be better. He had chosen to walk away. I stepped aside, nodding toward the apartment. "Come in." And just like that, Timur became part of my life in a way I had never expected. Over the following weeks, I helped him transfer schools, arranged for a stable living situation, and for the first time, he had the structure and support that his parents had never given him. He was smart, driven, and more aware of the consequences of greed than most adults I knew. I promised him that if he wanted to study finance, I would help him get there, that he would never have to worry about being manipulated the way his parents had manipulated everyone else. But there was still one last thing I needed to do. After finalizing the financial and legal fallout from Oluwa's actions, I made one final move, the same one my father had planned for all along. Using the inheritance that rightfully belonged to me, I bought back my father's house, the same house that had been stolen out from under my mother without her knowledge, the same house that had once been the center of our family before it became a bargaining chip in Oluwa's schemes. But instead of keeping it as some sentimental monument to the past, I turned it into something useful. I converted it into affordable housing for low-income families, ensuring that it would serve people who actually needed help instead of being hoarded as some status symbol. Ola had spent his entire life trying to take everything for himself, trying to squeeze every last drop of wealth and power out of those around him, and in the end, he had lost everything. And me? The brother he had always dismissed, the one he had called selfish and irresponsible? I had built something better with the very thing he tried to steal. Justice didn't always come in the form of court sentences or dramatic revenge. Sometimes, it was as simple as watching the person who had wronged you realize, too late, that they had destroyed themselves. And as I stood outside the newly renovated house, Timur beside me, ready to step into his own future, I knew one thing for sure. Ola had spent his entire life trying to win a game that he thought I didn't even know how to play. But in the end, I had beaten him at it without even trying. A few weeks after everything had settled, after Ola and Alina had disappeared from the family's conversations like a stain everyone wanted to forget, after my mother stopped calling in her half-hearted attempts to convince me to mend things, and after Timur had finally started settling into his new life with me, he came to me with a small request that caught me off guard. I had been in the living room, going through some work emails when he walked in, holding an old, slightly yellowed piece of paper in his hands. He hesitated for a moment, shifting his weight between his feet, before finally speaking. "Uncle Dima," he said carefully, "can I hang this in my room?" I looked up from my laptop and saw that he was holding a letter, one I recognized instantly. My father's letter. The last thing he had left behind for us, something I had found tucked away in his old study while sorting through documents. I hadn't thought much about it at the time, but Timur must have come across it when we were going through things together. I set my laptop aside and nodded toward the paper. "You sure?" Timur gave a small but determined nod. Yeah, I think it's important. I took the letter from him, unfolding it carefully, and my eyes landed on the single sentence that Timur had underlined. Asterisk, sometimes love is not forgiveness, but justice. Asterisk. I let out a slow breath as I read those words, my fingers tightening slightly around the edges of the paper. My father had known. He had understood long before I ever did that love wasn't about blind loyalty or endlessly forgiving those who hurt you. Love wasn't about being the bigger person while someone else took everything from you. Love, true love, was about standing up, about making sure that the people who deserved justice received it, even if it meant cutting off those who had once been closest to you. I looked at Timur, at this kid who had grown up in a household built on lies, who had watched his parents steal, manipulate, and destroy everything around them, and yet somehow, had managed to come out of it still believing in something better. I exhaled, nodding as I handed the letter back to him. Yeah, kid. Hang it up. He grinned, taking the paper back with the care of someone holding something sacred, and I watched as he disappeared into his room, already planning where he would put it. For the first time in my life, I understood what my real inheritance was. It wasn't the money, the house, or the assets that Ola had so desperately tried to take for himself. It wasn't even the business decisions I had made to protect what was left. My real inheritance was this: the honor, the values, the quiet but unshakable understanding that some things were worth fighting for, that justice mattered more than blind forgiveness, and that in the end, the only wealth that truly meant anything was the integrity you refused to compromise. Ola had spent his whole life chasing money and power, believing that those things would make him untouchable, believing that they would define his legacy. But in the end, all he had left was nothing. And me? I had saved more than just my inheritance. I had saved what mattered.